We're back with another review of a mini LED LCD monitor that was launched a few months ago. This time we're taking a look at the competitively priced KTC M27P6. It's a 27-inch monitor with a fast IPS LCD panel, a 4K resolution, 160Hz refresh rate, and a 1152 zone mini LED backlight for high-end HDR capabilities, including certification under the VESA Display HDR 1400 tier. It's also got a dual mode function allowing you to double the refresh rate to 320Hz when dropping to a lower 1080p resolution, so it could offer you an interesting option for different usage scenarios and gaming situations. We've recently reviewed a couple of other mini LED monitors from MSI, one with an IPS panel and a similar spec to this KTC screen, and another with an alternative VA LCD technology panel, one that we reviewed pretty recently, and so we're keen to see if this KTC model can offer some strong performance to go along with its strong feature set and pretty affordable price point. Let's start with the gaming performance. The 4K resolution provides a super sharp and clear image for 4K gaming with a high pixel density on a 27-inch screen size like this. Combined with a 160Hz refresh rate, it's a great combination for graphically focused gaming titles and for gamers who are looking to push resolution and image detail. The dual mode function provides a potentially useful option if you're instead wanting to prioritize frame rates and speed, and that allows you to double the refresh rate up to 320Hz if you drop down to a lower 1080p resolution. That's obviously a much lower and less detailed resolution, but on a 27-inch screen size like this, it's not terrible, and it looks a fair bit better than 32-inch size screens that offer this same function at 1080p. That dual mode does not operate with pixel perfect integer scaling, but it still looks pretty decent, and without loads of blurring or artifacts, in gaming and dynamic content it looks pretty decent. There's no shortcut key for this function, so you do either have to scroll through the menu each time you want to enable it or disable it, or perhaps set one of the hotkey shortcuts, which does make life a lot easier. Adaptive Sync is available to support variable refresh rates up to the maximum 320Hz, although there's no certification under any of the AMD, Nvidia or VESA schemes at this time. Being an IPS LCD panel, it's free from any visible flicker though during any VRR situations in our testing, which is great news. There's a good range of gaming features and extras available, like a black equalizer setting, FPS counter and so on, and there's also an MPRT blur reduction mode, which we'll take a look at in more detail shortly. Although quite unusually, there don't seem to be any preset modes for different gaming genres, only some professional preset modes and emulation modes for general usage. It's not a big loss, but unusual not to see those usual gaming preset modes that some people might like to use. When it comes to pixel response times, there's an overdrive setting in the on-screen menu with 5 different modes to choose between. Here's the results at the native 160Hz refresh rate in each mode. In the off mode, there's no overshoot at all, but the response times are too slow to keep up with the 160Hz refresh rate even. There's decent improvements in grey to grey speeds as you move up to the standard mode, and they can now keep up a lot better with the refresh rate. There's also no visible overshoot in practice in this mode. The advanced mode starts to push things a little bit more, improving the grey to grey response times a bit, but at the cost of some higher overshoot, although this remains reasonable in practice at this refresh rate. The maximum ultra-fast mode is even more aggressive, with large amounts of overshoot visible in motion, especially with pale halos, and you can start to make these out in the pursuit camera photos in that mode as well. We'll come back to talk about the additional dynamic overdrive mode in a moment, as that's a little bit unusual in its behaviour. During VRR situations, we need to find the best mode to balance response times and overshoot, and as it's normal for most LCD screens, the overshoot levels do start to creep up as the frame rate drops. In the standard mode, even down to 60Hz, the overshoot is only moderate and not too distracting in real usage at all, and this seems to be the optimal mode for VRR situations. The advanced mode was reasonable in its overshoot at 160Hz, but it gets really high at lower refresh rates, and that makes it a poor choice for VRR situations. The ultra fast mode is even worse, as that had lots of overshoot at 160Hz, and we want to avoid using that altogether as it just gets progressively worse as the refresh rate lowers. Stick with the standard overdrive setting for VRR situations when using the native 4K mode. One answer to controlling this overshoot variation at lower frame rates could be a variable overdrive function. That's a feature famously introduced on NVIDIA's native G-Sync module, and we've also seen it occasionally introduced separately by some display manufacturers, although often not in a very functional or useful way. Variable overdrive is designed to slow down the response times as the frame rate lowers in order to control the overshoot levels, and in theory that would allow you to offer an optimized variable overdrive setting instead of a typical single setting. KTC offer a setting in the menu labelled Dynamic Overdrive, which on the face of it looks like it should offer this, but in practice this really just behaves like the other modes, but the dynamic part of it is really that it will select one of the other modes depending on which frame rate you're first activating it at. So for example, if you're running at 160 FPS and you enable Dynamic Overdrive, the screen basically selects the Advanced Overdrive mode, which performs pretty well at that frame rate, but then as the frame rate lowers, the overshoot still increases substantially, exactly as we'd found when we just selected the Advanced Overdrive mode to start with. If on the other hand you are running at 60 FPS and then you enable Dynamic Overdrive, the screen sees that you're running at 60 Hz and opts to select a mode equivalent to the off mode, where the performance is great at 60 Hz with no overshoot, but as the frame rate increases, the response times then can't keep up. They're too slow then at the higher refresh rates, still without any overshoot, but because it's running in the off mode, basically it doesn't look good at the higher refresh rates. Basically, whatever frame rate you're running at when you enable this Dynamic Overdrive mode, the screen will choose one of the other modes in its optimal state for that frame rate, but then won't be optimal as the frame rate varies. It's not a true Dynamic Overdrive function like we explained earlier, and it just makes things complicated, we think. We'd suggest just sticking to the standard mode when gaming at 4K, as that's the best setting for all frame rates, including for VRR situations, and it does give you a single overdrive mode experience. Dual mode operation is the exception, and here's the response times at a couple of the higher refresh rates when using that mode in the standard overdrive setting. Overshoot is great at these higher refresh rates, but the response times can't really keep up properly now. Already about at their limit when we're at 160 Hz, and so you get some additional smearing on moving content for anything above that. If you move up to the advanced overdrive mode, things improve a bit, now keeping up with about 240 Hz, but struggling again with anything higher. Obviously in this mode though, at the lower end of the VRR range, the overshoot is much higher as we discussed earlier. The ultra-fast mode is even better at the higher frame rates and performs better at the maximum 320 Hz, but overshoot starts to become a problem from around 160 Hz and certainly anything lower than that. In the dual mode operation, you probably need to consider what kind of frame rates you're achieving, but you're presumably only going to be using this mode if you can push higher than 160 Hz anyway, and preferably 240 Hz and above. If not, then you might as well just leave the screen in its native 4K mode, even if you then wanted to lower your resolution in games to 1080p to drive more frame rates. So if you're using the dual mode and getting 240 FPS and above, we'd recommend using the ultra fast mode, which is the fastest and optimal. Just be aware that if the frame rates drop a lot lower, overshoot will be more noticeable. You could also potentially disable VRR and game at a fixed 320 Hz to avoid that variation resulting from the variable refresh rates, or instead resort to using older VSync on or off approaches, depending on what you prefer. KTC provide a strobing blur reduction mode on this screen as well, and that's available via the MPRT setting in the menu. This can operate at various fixed refresh rates as shown here, and it's available in both native 4K mode and dual mode 1080p as well. It's not available at the same time as variable refresh rates though, as is common for these kind of features, and it only works in SDR mode, not in HDR. Before we talk about the motion clarity benefits, let's just quickly cover the brightness control, which is a little bit strange on this model. When you enable MPRT mode, the brightness setting becomes locked and greyed out, but it operates at whatever you had it set at in the off mode before. So if you want the maximum brightness in MPRT mode, you need to first increase the brightness to 100 in the off configuration. Then when you enable MPRT, it will be locked at 100 and give you the maximum brightness possible in that performance. If you're using a much lower brightness for off mode, like you might be normally, and then you enable MPRT, it will be locked at a much darker setting. We measured up to 268 nits maximum in the native 160 Hz mode, which was decent, but it's annoying to have to manually change the brightness setting each time you want to turn MPRT on and off. It's a shame that it doesn't remember that setting independently between the on and off modes, And it's also a shame that you can't just manually change it while the MPRT mode is active as well. As to adjust brightness, you have to disable MPRT, change the brightness a bit, then re-enable MPRT mode and repeat until you find what you want. It's all a bit of a pain. One of the reasons why the dual mode refresh rates are a little bit darker is that the on period of the strobe is shorter in those dual mode relevant refresh rates as shown here, although it remains consistent at different refresh rates within native and within dual mode operation. From a motion clarity point of view, there's decent improvements in image sharpness with this mode enabled, and it's easier and clearer to track moving objects on the screen, although there are quite high levels of strobe crosstalk and ghost images, especially in the top region of the screen, but clearer in the middle and bottom areas. The overdrive mode can still be changed while you have MPRT mode active, but we'd recommend just sticking to the same settings that we discussed at length earlier for optimal performance and the clearest overall image. There's a small lag penalty of around 1.4 milliseconds when you enable the MPRT mode, but that's pretty minor thankfully. On the subject of lag, we measured this at various refresh rates, and this shows the total display lag made up partly from the signal processing delay and partly from the response times of the panel. You can see that this is very low at all of these fixed refresh rates, even at 60 Hz, which is great news. Lag when using the local dimming backlight in SDR and HDR is a bit of a more complex subject, and one that we're looking to test further in the near future. So rather than hold up the publication of this review, we'll exclude those results for now, but we'll try and pin a comment on this video as and when we've validated some further testing and results for that. Console support is good, with the panel handling 4K 120Hz content natively and support for 4K 24Hz and 50Hz video content too. There's VRR support, but no HDMI CEC function unfortunately, which could have been useful when powering on a connected console. Keep in mind as well that there's a headphone jack available for audio, but no integrated speakers on this model. You can use the backlight local dimming for both SDR and HDR gaming, and the MPRT blur reduction function is also available at 120Hz, which could be useful for some gamers. The screen offers a very wide brightness adjustment range in SDR, reaching up to the advertised 600 nits maximum and offering a reasonable lower adjustment range for darker room conditions too. Since it uses an IPS LCD panel, the native contrast ratio was weak compared with other panel technologies, although it's pretty typical for an IPS panel at around 1000 to 1. One particularly annoying thing is that whenever you change the brightness setting, you get a pop-up warning that it will change your power consumption. It does this every time, and there doesn't seem to be a way to disable it, even on the latest European firmware that we tested with our unit. This may or may not apply to other regional firmwares as well. In a new testing section, we also measured the near black shadow detail, and these graphs show measurements for the first 16 RGB shades near black. The yellow line represents the target luminance for each grey shade based on a 2.2 gamma and the measurements for white and black points, while the grey lines on the graph represent our measurements. The gamma tracking was very accurate near black, and all of the shades were above the visual threshold in a dimly lit room, but the first few shades are the same luminance as the black point, which leads to some black crush, and the first visible grey shade was therefore RGB4. This is one limitation with the weaker IPS technology contrast ratio compared with other technologies like VA and OLED. There is a black equalize setting in the menu which can tweak shadow detail if needed, and you could maybe move this up to a setting of 60 or maybe even 70 for darker content and dark gaming, which then brings out RGB1, but it also raises the black point a little. Worth experimenting perhaps for darker gaming situations. KTC allow you to enable the backlight local dimming in SDR mode as well, which is great news, and this can significantly improve the contrast and black depth, and it could be useful for gaming and multimedia. The luminance figures shown here for a 10% APL test are if you also push the brightness setting up to its maximum, and you can see that the maximum full frame contrast ratio improves significantly even with the low local dimming setting. The backlight dimming gets progressively stronger as you increase the setting, which leads to deeper blacks and an improvement to the maximum contrast, but at the same time it makes the image look a little bit darker overall. You'll probably want to experiment with this mode to find the one that you like the best, but we found it useful to set one of the hotkey shortcuts in the menu to the local dimming setting and another to the brightness control perhaps, so that as and when you want to enable this for certain SDR situations you can easily adjust both. We'd recommend only enabling local dimming though for SDR gaming and multimedia and other dynamic content, not for static and general usage, as there's some variation to the gamma and colour temperature when it's enabled. We'll look at that a little bit more in a moment. If we examine the brightness capability in each mode a bit more, we can see that all of the modes behave similarly for low APL tests, representing small highlights in dark content where the luminance is dimmed to help reduce haloing and blooming around those small highlights. That's a common and sensible approach on a mini LED monitor. Each mode can reach slightly different maximum luminance levels as well, with the standard mode reaching the same 600 nits as the off mode, the low mode getting a little bit brighter around 700 nits, and the high mode only reaching around 500 nits. While absolute brightness doesn't change that much when using local dimming in SDR, you can get big improvements to the contrast and black depth. We found the low mode retained the most accurate gamma and RGB balance, and we probably recommend that as the most accurate, although do experiment to see which mode you prefer. As we've seen on several mini LED monitors in the past, the main problem with the local dimming in low APL scenes is where the small highlights are a lot cooler than they should be, with a poor RGB balance leading to some bluish looking greys and a cooler overall image. This is only for small highlights where tight local dimming control is needed and shouldn't be a problem for the vast majority of usage. We didn't see any significant shifts in colour or colour temperature in normal general content with local dimming enabled, beyond that colour temp shift in certain lower APL scenes. For other testing, we won't go through all of the data and charts in detail here in the interest of time, but you can obviously pause the video if you want to delve into any of the details shown. We'll summarise the highlights and key takeaways for you here as well. The screen comes out of the box in the native preset mode, which operates with the full native gamma of the backlight. The gamma was nice and accurate at 2.2 and the grayscale colour temp was only slightly too cool, weighted a little bit towards the blue channel and giving a slightly bluish tint to greys. In this mode, the screen operates with its full native gamma, which extends a long way beyond the sRGB reference, as you can see here, up to around 143% relative coverage. That results in poor accuracy for SDR and sRGB colours, as is common on any wide gamut screen, but it gives you very saturated and vivid colours if that's what you want, and some people prefer that for gaming and multimedia anyway. We'll look at other ways to more accurately work with sRGB content in a moment if you need to. The native colour space of the screen is a little bit closer to the DCI-P3 reference space as shown here, but it still extends a bit beyond that even. Colour accuracy of DCI-P3 colours is good now, but with the wide colour space, it's still leading to oversaturation in some shades. KTC provide 3 emulation modes in the menu for working closely with different content and target colour spaces. sRGB mode offers no changes to the gamma or grayscale performance, and thankfully you still have access to change the brightness control in this menu as you do in the other emulation modes, but the settings for contrast, gamma and colour temp modes are now locked. Although it is set to the user colour temperature mode where you can tweak the RGB channels if you want, so that is useful at least. It looks like the default RGB levels of 50-50-50 are the same as the warm colour temperature mode, given that we have the same RGB balance and grayscale results here as the native mode before. The good thing about this mode is that it provides a very good clamping of the native colour space of the monitor back to sRGB, which then significantly improves the accuracy of sRGB colours, which are now very good in this mode. This offers an accurate configuration and performance for working with SDR and sRGB specific content, and it's a similar story then for the DCI-P3 emulation mode, which again has the same gamma and grayscale performance with a reliable clamping of the colour space back closer to DCI-P3. Colour accuracy was now good for DCI-P3 content, a colour space often used for HDR. KTC also helpfully provide an Adobe RGB emulation mode with the same gamma and grayscale again, and good clamping back to this colour space with improved colour accuracy, and this mode can be useful then for anyone wanting to work with photography applications where Adobe RGB is a common target colour space. You can use any of these 3 modes that you like really for general content depending on which colour space you want to work with. You may also want to check out our calibrated settings and ICC profile, which were created in the user mode but with the ICC profile mapped back to sRGB for use in colour aware applications. You'll find a link to our best settings guide for this screen, covering SDR, HDR, gaming and everything else, and our calibrated ICC profile in the description below. The screen is well suited to office and general usage with a high resolution and pixel density along with a solid feature set. Being an LCD panel, you don't have any of the concerns that you might have with an OLED panel around image retention, burn-in or abnormal subpixel layout, which is good news, and the panel uses a standard RGB stripe layout, so text clarity is very good. especially with the 4K resolution and the high pixel density that's offered here. With a 4K resolution packed into a 27-inch size screen, you get a super sharp and clear image, better than common 1440p resolutions that are available in this size. You will need to use OS scaling to avoid the text and icons being tiny, but at 150% you get the same desktop area as a 1440p monitor, just with a much higher pixel density for a very sharp and clear image. 125% scaling would give you some further desktop space as long as it doesn't look too small for you. This model has a standard light anti-glare matte coating, as with other modern IPS LCD panels, which provides good glare and reflection handling with minimal visible grain. The IPS panel provides the usual wide viewing angles and stable image that you'd expect from this technology, although a pale IPS glow is visible when viewed from an angle like you'd see on most IPS panels when looking at darker content. So this is definitely best viewed from a head-on viewing position. There's a very good range of connections with DP 1.4 to HDMI 2.1 and a USB Type-C, which offers DP alt mode and 65 watts power delivery, which is handy for single cable connectivity from laptops and other devices. There's also two USB-A data ports and a headphone connection, but note that there's no speakers on this model. With USB-C present, there's also a KVM switch function, but there's no support for picture-in-picture or picture-by-picture mode, sadly, on this model. The stand provides a full range of ergonomic adjustments, which are all smooth and mostly easy to use, although there is a fair bit of wobble to the screen as you move it, or when you're using the on-screen menu. The on-screen menu provides a good range of options and settings, and access is quick and easy thanks to the joystick toggle on the back right-hand side, although it is a little bit clunky activating some of the settings as you have to use the right direction, and the warning message about the power consumption every time you change the brightness is really annoying. We also confirm the screen operates with a flicker-free backlight, free from any PWM dimming, which is great news, which includes when the local dimming backlight is enabled from the menu. A low blue light setting is available in the menu as well for settings of 0, 25, 50, 75 and 100, which makes the image progressively warmer and reduces the blue light output as a result. But above a setting of about 50, it starts to look really yellow, so we wouldn't recommend going any higher than that. But modes 25 and 50 offer some reasonable appearance. When it comes to HDR support, the mini LED backlight featured here significantly improves brightness and contrast in HDR usage compared with typical LCD monitors. The backlight is split into 1,152 local dimming zones behind the panel, with each zone capable of being dimmed and brightened independently. That's a big step up from normal LCD monitors, which typically have a very limited number of dimming zones along the edges, sometimes 8 or maybe 16, or in many cases just none at all. With LCD monitor local dimming, basically the more zones the better in terms of offering greater control over the image, reducing the presence of halos and blooms around bright objects, and increasing the brightness and contrast as much as possible. An OLED panel takes us a step further, of course, with per pixel level dimming, which is excellent, but mini LED monitors can reach much brighter in HDR where needed, and the 1,152 zones that are available here is a high number for an LCD panel of this size. In real world usage, there are pretty low levels of blooming and halos in general mixed content, even in many darker games, although in extreme situations like this Christmas light scene for instance, the blooming becomes more noticeable as the backlight tries to accommodate small bright areas on otherwise dark backgrounds, and the native contrast ratio of the IPS panel is also low. This screen does seem to have a tendency towards maximising brightness instead of contrast, so there is perhaps a little bit more blooming than on some other mini LED IPS screens that we've seen, but it really only impacts small bright highlights on very dark backgrounds like nighttime scenes and that kind of thing. One noticeable challenge with all IPS mini LED screens that we've tested before is that the blooming and halos are accentuated by the off-angle IPS glow of the underlying panel, something that you don't get on competing VA mini LED screens. As a result, it's definitely better to view the screen from a head-on viewing position for HDR and when using the local dimming setting in either HDR or SDR mode. One thing we did notice was some quite obvious flickering in both SDR and HDR mode when using the local dimming feature when the refresh rate was low at 60 Hz. It looks like the local dimming zone activation is causing the flickering, which is mostly hidden then at higher refresh rates, including the native 160 Hz, although they're still a little bit detectable for very small moving objects, where the dimming zone control is more finite. This is maybe something to keep in mind if you're connecting low fixed refresh rate external devices like media streaming sticks or games consoles, or perhaps in VRR situations if your frame rate drops low. We didn't see any issues with this at higher refresh rates though, and in normal HDR content. The screen has been certified under the VESA Display HDR 1400 tier, meaning a peak brightness of over 1400 nits and a wide colour gamut covering 98% DCI-P3 according to the specs. This screen has 4 different HDR preset modes available to choose between, and again that annoying pop-up about power consumption appears from the menu every time you want to change these, although at least you only really have to set this once you've found the mode that you like. You won't need to change this repeatedly at least. This first test shows the peak white luminance capabilities in each mode, and you can see that the mode labelled VESA Display HDR can reach the brightest and highest luminance, while the HDR Cinema mode is similar but can't quite reach as bright in higher APL scenes. The HDR Game mode is quite a bit darker, and the HDR 600 mode is much darker still, reaching around 600 nits maximum in any situation, which we wouldn't recommend using as a result. If we measure various real scene HDR situations, you can see the same kind of pattern appears here as well in real content, and the VESA Display HDR mode provides the brightest, most impactful HDR experience, which we think most people will want to use. We'll stick with that VESA Display HDR mode then for our testing here. You can see some peak white luminance measurements here compared with other recently tested mini LED screens from MSI, and also a modern 5th gen QD-OLED monitor for reference. The MSI IPS mini LED screen reaches very similar brightness to this KTC model, which is perhaps unsurprising, and both can reach brighter than the VA mini LED MSI monitor in higher APL scenes where needed. Although the VA panel does show better contrast and reduced blooming compared with the IPS panels, especially from an angle. This mini LED monitor has the hardware capabilities to get far brighter in HDR content than any OLED monitor released so far, and as you can see from this graph where we've compared the peak white luminance against one of the latest 5th gen QD OLED monitors, you can see that the peak highlights in dark scenes can reach quite a bit brighter on the OLED screens, where the per pixel level dimming avoids halos and blooming that could be a challenge on mini LED backlights, even with a high number of dimming zones. On the mini LED monitor, the brightness is toned down for those low APL scenes to avoid blooming issues, but once the APL increases above about 5%, the maximum brightness capabilities of the mini LED far exceed what's possible from any OLED monitor, where ABL dimming is needed due to the way OLED monitors are powered and how they work. It's no contest in terms of the brightness capabilities of mini LED versus OLED, although do keep in mind that you would need actual content to be mastered in these very high levels for the differences to be substantial as they are in the measurements here. In some scenes there may not be much of a visual difference in real use if the content isn't calling for a higher brightness anyway. The mini LED backlight can certainly support higher HDR brightness across a range of scenes than OLED panels without needing to dim as aggressively, and it's great to see that this technology is now being used more widely in the LCD market to enhance performance, and now without raising the price tag too substantially either. Beyond the 4 HDR preset modes, there's also control over the local dimming setting, which has options for off, low, standard, high and auto available. You can see that the luminance capabilities in each local dimming mode are very similar, and there's some small additional maximum contrast benefits if you move up from the low mode to either the standard or high, but it's pretty minor and hard to see that in visual tests and real usage. However, we found the EOTF tracking to be a little bit better in the low mode, whereas the other modes start to show some slight darkening of the image, and so with that in mind, we think the low mode is likely to be optimal for HDR, like it was in fact for SDR when you were using the local dimming setting. One limitation with the local dimming control is that the setting is remembered between SDR and HDR modes. So if you set it on low, for instance, in HDR, that means that it will also be enabled and operating in low mode for SDR when you switch back to that. You could set it to low and use it that way in both SDR and HDR modes, which we've found is the optimal setting, although you'd probably then also want to turn it off altogether for some static desktop applications and general usage in SDR. You could set one of the menu shortcuts for the local dimming control. That makes life a lot easier and is probably the best approach. Just set it on low for both modes and then disable it for SDR when you're going to use it for general applications. You could also perhaps leave it on the default auto mode, which turns local dimming off in SDR and then activates it on high in HDR mode, which makes life easier if you don't really want to use it at all in SDR. Having settled then on the VESA display HDR mode and the low local dimming setting, we measured the screen at various APL, from low APL that represent bright highlights in dark overall scenes to high APL which represent brighter overall scenes. The EOTF tracking remained pretty consistent in each mode, which was good news, with a little bit of roll-off impacting some of the lightest grey shades in lower APL scenes. But as we've seen with other mini LED monitors in the past, the grayscale's colour temperature varies depending on the APL of the scene, and in particular the blue channel balance seems to vary. In the low APL scenes the grayscale is overly cool, but balanced out better for higher APL scenes, although it is a little bit weighted then towards green in those situations. We've seen similar variants in grayscale temp on other mini LED monitors that we've tested in the past, so this is common behaviour on this technology it seems. This was using the warm colour temperature setting in the on-screen menu by the way, with the other three modes being even cooler and bluer still. Weirdly, the user mode is available in HDR, but doesn't allow you to alter the RGB channels unfortunately, even though we could do that in SDR mode when using that option. It seems that the user mode operates with the same RGB levels as you've set in SDR mode, but once local dimming is active in this situation, that skews the colour balance and colour temperature, so it's not ideal. It's probably best just to stick with the warm mode in HDR, as the calibrated user mode from the SDR operation ends up being cooler in HDR. If we look at the more detailed results for a 10% APL test, we can see that the grayscale accuracy is worse in light shades here, where there is a more pronounced green-blue tint to those shades, and they're darker than intended due to the EOTF roll-off, which leads to some loss of detail in brighter areas. Still, the EOTF accuracy for this mode was good, and colour temperature and grayscale accuracy does improve a bit as the higher APL scenes come into play. Shadow detail was a problem in HDR though, and we saw poor results in all of the HDR and local dimming modes. The luminance of the near black shades only passed the visual threshold for viewing in a dimly lit room at around RGB 9, which you could make out, but then the luminance of RGB 10, 11 and 12 were also the same, so those get crushed too, which loses some detail in those areas. There is a black equalize setting in the on-screen menu which you can use in HDR mode too, and that helps a bit if you bump it up from the default 50 to 60. Blacks get slightly raised, but only a small amount, and you can make out a few extra grey shades near black, but only from RGB 4 onwards in this mode, as everything below that is still basically crushed to the same luminance. The black equalize setting of 70 brings out all of the RGB shades from 1 onwards and makes them a lot brighter and easier to see, but unfortunately they're now really too bright, and it also raises blacks quite a lot, so it's really not recommended. The colour space in HDR mode seems to have been clamped back a little bit compared with the measurements we'd seen in SDR native mode, being closer now to the DCI-P3 colour space and reducing the 114% relative coverage we'd seen in native mode down to 107% relative here. This means that colours are slightly less saturated, and there's also a little less coverage for the Rec 2020 colour space, down from around 82% to 78% now. Colour accuracy for these HDR colours was good overall though. Overall, the KTC M27P6 is a very good mini LED gaming monitor, offering a good spec and feature set at a decent price point. The 4K 160Hz mode provides a great picture quality for productivity and general usage, as well as supporting high resolution and 4K gaming. Alongside that, the 1080p dual mode gives you a nice bump in refresh rates, motion clarity and frame rate support for different gaming situations. The mini LED backlight offers a bright and impactful HDR experience, although there were a few issues with black crush in HDR and some higher levels of blooming in certain viewing situations than competing VA mini LED monitors to consider. The M27P6 is available to buy now, priced at the time of recording at £400 in the UK, but you can check latest pricing and availability for your region using our affiliate link in the description below. You can also find a link to our best settings guide and calibrated ICC profile there if you own the screen and want to check those out. And if you found this video useful, please give us a quick like below, that would be appreciated. And do leave us any comments or questions that you might have below as well. We've got loads of other monitor reviews, content and coverage coming up soon, so make sure you hit subscribe to stay up to date on all of that. Thank you for watching, we'll catch you next time.